I've been pretty open about my distaste for the last two Zelda games. While I enjoyed aspects of them, overall they're just very different games from what I want. And especially after they alluded to never returning to the formula I want, I had little expectation to enjoy the series going forward. I clung to the idea that maybe they'd keep this new direction just for the 3D games, and a future 2D game would retain the structure I wanted. These hopes were dashed though after they announced Echoes of Wisdom as soon as they showed the gameplay. Playing as Zelda instead of Link is a neat idea, and having Tri accompany you on your journey reminded me of Ocarina of Time at first, but the second they showed the Tri-Rod I became apprehensive, and it only got worse every time they summoned a table. The trailer made it look to me like it was going to be a 2D Tears of the Kingdom, and there's possibly nothing I want less than that. There were some things I did like, what little we saw that looked like an actual dungeon gave me some solace, but while I was always going to buy the game, I was resigned to yet another game I wouldn't actually enjoy. My initial hands-on with the game only reinforced my already bleak outlook. The first moments playing as Link is like the end of any normal Zelda game, albeit a little cut down from how strong you'd expect to be. Beating Ganon as your tutorial felt like a great introduction to the new game, and Link's capture is a cool reversal of the usual trope. Zelda's arrival back at Hyrule Castle only to be thrown in jail by an evil version of the king sets up the rest of the game well, laying forth the immediate plan of finding the king and his advisors, as well as the long-term plan of rescuing Link and fixing the rifts. It's not long after this, though, that it appeared all of my fears would come true. As a means of escaping your prison, Tri gives you with the Tri-Rod, granting you the ability to move objects in the world and, more importantly, summon echoes. These abilities immediately felt very similar to some from Tears of the Kingdom. Moving things with Tri is just like using Ultra Hand, although generally less useful, and summoning echoes is very similar to using Zonai devices, even including the same awful menu. A menu which only gets worse the further in you get as you unlock more and more echoes. Escaping the dungeon is your tutorial for these systems, after which Impa tells you to meet her brother to the south. To get there though, you'll have to do your first dungeon. On the way, you'll have to work out how to do combat without your usual array of weapons, and this is honestly my least favourite part of the game. For an experience so built around combat, it just feels awful. That is, unless you decide to just skip combat entirely, which I would regularly do by summoning echoes for tables, beds, or trampolines, and then walking around on the treetops rather than through the enemy-laden paths the game provides. At first, you'll have nothing to defend yourself with except the ability to throw rocks, which you'll have to use to defeat at least your first enemy. One thing I will say is nice, though, is that defeating an enemy will always drop its echo if you haven't already claimed it, so at least you don't have to worry about random drops. After defeating and collecting your first enemy, from that point onwards, the game revolves around summoning said enemy to fight for you while you just kind of stand off to the side and wait. It's at best a boring experience, just waiting for two AIs to battle while you maybe throw pots or wander around until it's over, but it's also incredibly frustrating at times due to just how reticent your echoes seem to be to actually attack. Combat quickly becomes something you'll want to avoid if you can, only really being worth doing if you particularly want either the echo from a new enemy or a chest the monsters may be guarding. Later in the game, I came to a strategy of summoning a ball and chain trooper and then carrying him around with Tri, purely because them spinning the ball and chain around the head meant I could rub them against whatever enemy I was facing at the time to do damage in a method I actually had some control over. Reaching the dungeon requires you to traverse the Still World, the world beyond the rifts which have opened up across Hyrule. Tri allows you to enter the rift, and completing said rift will close it, be that a small rift, completed by just finding some of Tri's friends hiding in the area, or the larger rift by doing one of the game's main dungeons. These dungeons are by far my favourite parts of the game, as outside of the lackluster combat I've already mentioned, they manage to capture the enjoyment I'd get from other Zelda titles. There's even an awful water dungeon, it's completely on brand. The mid-boss of the first dungeon though was where things got weird. You'll fight an evil version of Link, which off the bat doesn't sound like a bad idea. What confused me though was that upon its defeat, Zelda gains the ability to, for all intents and purposes, turn into Link. A new gauge is unlocked, which can be filled with energy found in the Still World and can then be used to turn into Link, during which you'll gain the use of a sword and later on other weapons, as well as an upgrade to your jump. They also introduce walls of goo at this point, which you can only cut through with the sword. I don't like this. Outright, I just don't. I especially don't like that pretty much the only way to defeat the bosses throughout the game is with the sword. I just don't see the point of it. The Tri-Rod already feels like what would otherwise be a single dungeon item in any other Zelda game, but building the entire game around it could have been interesting. A more puzzle-centric focus, rather than combat, would make sense, or at least make the Echo AI easier to control in combat. It seems though that they didn't trust the system enough, so fell back to the traditional sword and shield combat to carry it, and it's honestly a detriment to the entire game. If you're going to give me the ability to turn into Link, why am I not just playing Link? What's the point in this? This was arguably the lowest point for me. I didn't like the combat, I didn't like how fussy summoning the echoes was, I didn't like the ability to turn into Link. What did I actually like? Well, for one, I liked the more structured storytelling from this game. While after the first dungeon the game does open up a bit, letting you choose which of the next 2 dungeons to head to next, the storytelling is of a much more linear fashion than that of Breath of the Wild. You can't accidentally stumble into late game plot reveals like you could in Tears of the Kingdom, you have to do the task set forth before you can get to the next section. There's still an emphasis on exploration, which did mean at times I felt like I was missing out on side quests and things, but the exploration at least is primarily between story locations, after which you'll have a more linear path until its completion. The dungeons themselves are, as I've already mentioned, a high point in the game. While perhaps a little bit easy and still revolving a lot around the combat I don't enjoy, they're overall just well-designed challenges. Each one revolves around its core theme, a standout one being the late-game dungeon themed around fire and ice, and while I actually think that's also the worst dungeon in the game, it's at least got a memorable and consistent theme around using fire to melt ice rooms or ice to freeze water rooms. I also quite like the use of accessories to give Zelda new abilities or upgrades, though I wish they'd been implemented a bit better. Some make you take less damage, some increase drops, and by far the most useful one increases your jump height. You can only equip a few at a time, but if you find the Great Fairy you can upgrade to a maximum of 5 at once, and it's pretty easy to do that. My main complaint about this though is that I think the means of acquiring them is just kind of boring. Each shop in the world sells an accessory, plus there's a few you can get from side stories or in chests, but I think it would have been great if they had replaced the items you get from a traditional dungeon. While they wouldn't fulfill the same role, the dungeons as they are do feel a bit lacking in rewards, and this could have easily taken that place. The rewards from chests overall are quite boring, honestly. Besides rupees and the aforementioned few accessories, the vast majority of what you'll find will be crafting items for smoothies. Smoothies can be made to give you some boosts or heal, but I never really felt the need to use them. The game is pretty easy, and even when it was difficult, the tried and true method of carrying a fairy in a bottle was all I needed to keep myself alive. There's a little more disappointing than spending time solving a puzzle only to get some apples out of a chest at the end. I'd honestly prefer it if you could just buy the smoothies or ingredients and the chests were all full of rupees. I dislike a lot of things in the game, but I also like a fair bit. Is there anything I really loved though? Conde. I would do anything for Conde. I think the characters overall are a strong point. Some are better than others, obviously, but they're all memorable in their own ways, from the bickering Zora chieftains to the insecure Goron leader. The character you'll by far spend the most time with though is Tri, and they're at least inoffensive. They aren't annoying in the way some people find Navi, though personally I was never bothered, but they also don't really do anything outside of cutscenes. Within cutscenes they're pretty one note, just about everything revolves around them not understanding anything really, besides how to close rifts. It's not exactly annoying, but there isn't really anything there to grab onto, no deep emotional connection to be made. Another thing I really liked are the stamp rallies. They're not especially popular in real life here, they tend to be around, but they're also either unused or vandalised, which is a shame. When my wife and I went to Japan, they were all over the place though, and while they're obviously meant for children, there's just something fun about visiting all sorts of places and getting a stamp to commemorate your trip. Finding all the stamps throughout Hyrule managed to capture this feeling really well, though I wish Zelda herself was a little more enthused with the process. It's kind of played as a joke, like we should mock the stamp guy, but he's one of my favourite characters. I've come across a lot more negative in this than I'd like to, honestly. Part of that is just because I find it a lot easier to talk about the things I don't like than the things that I do, but another part is because I'm actively trying to avoid going too deep into things because I really do think you should play it. Echoes of Wisdom comes so close to being what I actually want, it just strays in some weird ways. There are some simple changes I think could have been made to things which would improve the game drastically. I really think the game would be infinitely better if Zelda could turn into Sheik rather than Link, but even in this flawed state, it's a damn sight better than what we've got for the last few games. Using the Tri-Rod purely to solve puzzles, while using a non-limited Sheik form for the combat would probably fix a lot of my issues with the game, but at that point it's probably too close to old Zelda for Nintendo to be happy with. My complaints aren't even really about the direction Zelda has been taking recently, they're more about Nintendo as a whole. We haven't had a new Star Fox game in 7 years, or 8 if you don't include the massively delayed release of Star Fox 2, and it's been even longer than that since we've had a good one. Not to mention F-Zero, it's been 21 years since the last proper release here, though I'll admit F-Zero 99 is pretty fun. It just seems that we can only get games from them now if they reinvent the wheel, and while there's always space for experimentation, sometimes a wheel is just the best shape. I do hope we get more Zelda games like this in the future. While I'm not the biggest fan of some of the choices they've made, the linear storytelling and structured presentation for the game is exactly what I want. When I sit down to play any game really, but especially a Zelda game, I want a curated story experience to go through, and that's what I feel has been most lacking since Breath of the Wild. I don't want a Zelda-themed playspace so I can make up stories of my adventures to tell my friends. I want an actual story written by people with a clear vision that I can think about for years to come. That's why Ocarina of Time is one of my favourite games, it's why I keep coming back to the series in the hope it returns to what I would consider its core, and it's why The Legend of Zelda Echoes of Wisdom is almost the Zelda I love. Special thanks to my patrons, Justin Wood, Hobbs, and Koopy Vegeta. You can join my patrons at patreon.com/HoldenGatsby, check out my TikTok and Twitter @HoldenGatsby, and follow me on Twitch at twitch.tv/HoldenGatsby. Don't forget to subscribe to all of my channels. If you want more, you can watch my last video now, but if not, then thanks for sticking around.